Imagine yourself in a huge, desolate valley, covered in nothing but dry, scattered bones, lifeless, hopeless, a place that seems beyond salvation. It is against this dark backdrop that today's story begins, a story full of mystery, power, and an unimaginable miracle. If you have ever felt as if everything was lost, as if life had dried up around you, this story will touch your heart deeply. Ezekiel's journey into the Valley of Dry Bones is one of the most shocking and mysterious aspects of the Bible, revealing that when God speaks, even the impossible bows before His word. Are you ready to discover how the impossible can become reality? Subscribe to the channel for more exciting biblical stories, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any videos. If you like the content, don't forget to send a thanks a lot. And if you want to support the channel even more, become a member and gain access to exclusive benefits. Ezekiel, one of the great prophets of the Old Testament, never imagined that his life would take such an extraordinary turn. He was an ordinary man, living in exile with the people of Israel, suffering the consequences of years of disobedience and distance from God. The streets where he walked were sad, full of tired faces and broken hopes. The longing for their homeland squeezed everyone's hearts, and the silence often seemed heavier than the chains that kept them away from home. But amid this bleak scenario, something unexpected happened. One day, Ezekiel felt something different. He couldn't say what it was at first, just a restlessness, an invisible but powerful presence. And then, as if the clouds in the sky had parted to reveal something great, he heard it. It was no ordinary voice, but the voice of God, clear and unmistakable. It resonated, as if it were the echo of thunder itself. The call came so directly that there was no room for doubt. God was calling him to a greater mission, a simple man of flesh and blood, chosen to transmit the Creator's messages. It was hard to believe that amid the chaos of exile, Ezekiel had been chosen for something so significant. What did God have in mind? Ezekiel, still absorbing the weight of the call he had received, was transported in spirit to a desolate place. When his feet touched the ground, he looked around and found himself in a vast valley. The silence was disturbing. There was no sign of life, just dry bones scattered everywhere. They stretched as far as his eyes could see, covering the ground, creating a scene that seemed straight out of a nightmare. The wind blew weakly, stirring up the dust and revealing more and more bones. It wasn't just a few, they were countless. Those bones, white and dried out by time, told a story that no one else could hear. Ezekiel stood still, staring at that sea of bones, feeling the weight of death hanging in the air. The loneliness was palpable, and the emptiness of that place seemed to reflect the spiritual state of the people of Israel, lifeless, hopeless, directionless. Each scattered bone represented more than just bodies that had perished. There was something deeper there, something that went beyond physical death. The prophet did not know what was coming, but the scenario that presented itself before him was more than symbolic. It all seemed to carry a dark meaning, and at the same time, full of possibilities. Suddenly, amid the harrowing silence of the valley, a voice once again echoed within Ezekiel. It was the same voice that had called him before, but now it brought a question that would challenge him deeply. God wanted to know if those dead bones could come back to life. He looked at the valley once more, his eyes roaming over the dry, brittle remains. That was the perfect symbol of hopelessness, of what was beyond repair. There was no sign of life, not even a trickle of power or anything to suggest the possibility of change. It was death in its purest and most complete form. The prophet, however, knew that he was not there by chance. And faced with that question, he took a deep breath. The answer was not in his hands. He was not a man of supernatural powers. He was just a messenger. So, with humility, Ezekiel looked up and replied, "Lord God, you know." These words carried a profound truth. Only God had the answer to that mystery. He knew that if life could return to those bones, it would be by God's will, not by human logic. Ezekiel felt that something important was about to happen, but he didn't know exactly what it would be. Those dry, lifeless bones were part of something much bigger, something he still didn't fully understand, and that would change everything. But the miracle did not happen immediately. Instead, God gave Ezekiel a command. He was to speak to the bones, commanding them to arise and hear the word of the Lord. Ezekiel heard God's command, and it seemed as incomprehensible as it was powerful. How could he, a simple man, speak to dry bones and expect something to happen? But deep down, he knew it wasn't about what he could do, but about what God was about to accomplish through him. The mission was clear. He must prophesy, declare life on that which seemed irreversibly dead. The voice of God had spoken, and now it was Ezekiel's turn. The valley was quiet. The wind whispered lightly between the scattered bones. But something in the air seemed to change. The prophet took a deep breath, raised his voice, and began to speak. The words flowed with authority, words that came not from him, but directly from the Creator. Dry bones, hear the word of the Lord. And the words were released over the empty valley, like a powerful echo that reverberates in the deep silence. It was a surreal scene. There was Ezekiel, in front of lifeless bones, prophesying restoration, talking about flesh that would return to cover the bones, sinews that would unite again, and life that would return to those abandoned bodies. And as he spoke, something began to happen. A mysterious sound cut through the air, a light noise, almost imperceptible at first, but soon intensified. A subtle movement spread across the valley. Bones began to move. It was as if an invisible magnet was pulling them towards each other, each bone finding its match, rebuilding bodies. The dry sound of bones connecting filled the air. Ezekiel watched wide-eyed as the prophetic vision took shape before him. The sound of bones coming together grew louder with every second, like an unexpected melody emerging from the absolute silence. The valley, which was once just a desert of dry bones, was now full of movement. Ezekiel watched, barely breathing, as the skeletons began to take shape. Each bone found its exact place. The arms joined the shoulders, the legs fixed in the right place. It was a surreal scene, almost as if time had turned around and everything that was broken was starting to come back together. As the bones came together, tendons appeared, stretching like invisible ropes, tying each part of the body together perfectly. After that, flesh began to cover the skeletons. The skin, soft and smooth, sealed everything, giving shape to the bodies that were now complete. An army of restored but still immobile bodies. It was an impressive sight, but at the same time, something was missing. The valley was full of bodies, perfect in shape but still lifeless. They looked more like statues than human beings, as if time had stopped the instant flesh covered them. Ezekiel, watching all that, felt an expectation growing within him. The work was incomplete, and the silence that hung over the place seemed to wait for something more. What was missing? What still needed to be done for those bodies to rise? It was then that God, once again, spoke to Ezekiel. This time the order was clear and different. Prophesy to the Spirit. Tell the Spirit to come from the four winds and blow on these dead people, so that they may live. This was more than words. The breath, the Spirit, was the essence of life. Without it, no matter how complete the bodies were, they would still be just empty shells. Ezekiel, with the same obedience and confidence as before, raised his voice once again. He prophesied to the wind, calling the Spirit from every corner of the earth. Come, O Spirit, and breathe upon these dead. His words echoed in the valley, and something began to change. The wind began to blow, light at first, but quickly gaining strength. It was as if the air had been filled with an invisible energy, something Ezekiel could feel in every pore of his skin. The wind, now strong and determined, circulated through the valley like an invisible force, but charged with power. The air was permeated with something divine, and Ezekiel could feel it in every fiber of his being. The previous silence, dense and static, was now completely broken by the sound of the wind that passed between the motionless bodies, bringing with it something they desperately needed: life. Little by little, the bodies began to respond to the call of the Spirit. Chests began to rise and fall, breathing for the first time in a long time. Ezekiel watched with his eyes fixed, without blinking. Hands that were previously rigid now moved gently. Closed eyes suddenly opened, revealing the brightness of life that returned to inhabit those figures. What were once just empty shells now pulsed with vitality. The Spirit had entered each of those bodies, and, as if by a miracle that Ezekiel had just witnessed, they began to rise. It was like watching the impossible happening before your eyes. One by one, they rose to their feet, like soldiers returning from a long battle, now ready to live again. The valley, once filled with dry, lifeless bones, was now filled with an army of revived men, standing firm and standing. But as he looked at those figures, he knew that the scene went far beyond restored flesh, sinew, and bone. It was more than bodies that had been lifted. There was a greater purpose. Something profound was being revealed, a message from God for Ezekiel, for the people of Israel, and for the future. Each of those men, once bones scattered on the ground, represented something powerful. They were a living symbol of God's own people, who were also in ruins, exiled, scattered, without hope. Just like dry bones, Israel seemed to be dead, lifeless, with no prospect of a future. But there, in that valley, God showed that death was not the end. The valley of dry bones was a metaphor for the restoration he promised for his people. The army that now rose before Ezekiel was a foreshadowing of what God would do with Israel. The people who had been destroyed, like those bones, would be brought back to life, restored, united, and full of vigor again. It was a promise of rebirth, of a future in which despair would be replaced by hope and death by life. God, upon seeing the army formed before Ezekiel, began to reveal the deep meaning of that vision. The valley of dry bones was not just about dead and restored bodies. Those bones symbolized the house of Israel, a people that, from the outside, seemed destroyed, aimless, lifeless. Just as the bones were dried up and scattered, Israel had been devastated, taken into exile, with no hope of a future. God then spoke to Ezekiel, explaining what it all meant. The people of Israel said, "Our bones are dry. Our hope is gone. We are completely alone." They believed they were irretrievably lost, abandoned by God. The vision was a reflection of this deep anguish, of the people's state of mind. But God, through that impressive scene, was showing that he had not given up. Just as the bones were restored and given life, Israel would be brought back. The valley was a powerful symbol, a metaphor for renewal. God's promise was clear. "Behold, I will open your graves and bring you out of them, O my people, and I will bring you into the land of Israel." It was not just a physical rebirth, but a spiritual promise. The life he was giving was not just for the bodies, but for the souls and hearts of his people. Israel would have a new chance, a new life, a complete restoration. God's promise went beyond simply bringing the bones to life and restoring the people of Israel to their land. There was something even deeper to be done. God told Ezekiel that he would not only open the graves and bring them back to the promised land, but that he himself would put his spirit within them. It was a promise of new life, not just for bodies, but for hearts. "I will put my spirit in you, and you will live." These words resonated like a melody of hope, echoing deep within Ezekiel's soul. It wasn't just about returning to a physical place. God was talking about a spiritual rebirth. The transformation he was planning for Israel was far greater than any physical restoration. He would give the people something they had lost, the breath of life that comes directly from him, the very Spirit of God dwelling in his people, renewing their strength, transforming their souls. This meant that Israel would not only become a nation again, but would be a people renewed from within, guided by the Spirit of God himself. The divine presence would no longer be something distant, something they only looked for in temples or in ancient rituals. Now, God himself promised to be within them, guiding each step, strengthening them from the inside out. Ezekiel understood the depth of this promise. It was a call for a new covenant, something far more intimate and powerful than the people had ever experienced. Ezekiel began to realize that God's plan went far beyond what his eyes could see. It was not just about restoring Israel as a nation, but about radical change that began in the heart. The people who had turned away from God would experience a spiritual rebirth. They would no longer be guided only by laws written in stone, but by the Holy Spirit himself, who would dwell in each one of them. It was a new covenant, a new form of relationship with the Creator. The breath of life that had brought back the dry bones was a metaphor for what was about to happen to the spirit of Israel. God would not only revive them, but transform them into a new people, capable of living according to his will. The irony was clear. The people who were previously dead, both physically and spiritually, would now be the living example of God's presence on earth, a nation that, despite all adversity, would rise from the ashes, renewed inside and out. The vision of the valley of dry bones expanded in meaning with each word God spoke. Revealed to Ezekiel, the promise to restore Israel, to bring her people together again, was more than a promise of a physical return to the land. It was the complete renewal of a nation that, even destroyed and scattered, would be reunited as one body, one people, guided by God. Ezekiel could feel the power of this restoration, a union that transcended exile and dispersion. The once separated and lifeless bones now stood together, ready to march in a new direction, like an army revived for a greater purpose. God had promised to reunite Israel again, bringing them back to their land, but more importantly, he would make them a nation united, not just by ties of blood, but by the Spirit who would guide them. Ezekiel was there, witnessing the future. He knew that the people of Israel, like the dry bones, would live again. They would experience a new era, marked by the constant presence of God. The lesson that emerged from this vision was clear. Even in the darkest moments, when everything seems to be lost, when hope is gone, God can restore, bring life to what seems irretrievably dead. Ezekiel, an ordinary man, was faced with something that no human being could resolve on his own: the vision of a valley full of dry bones, symbols of despair and death. However, what he did in the face of this transformative scene is what teaches us one of the greatest lessons. He heard God's voice, trusted his words, and prophesied, even when everything around him said it was impossible. Ezekiel did not have the power to bring life to those bones, but he had something even more powerful: the faith and obedience to act as divinely directed. Those bones, which represented the people of Israel, also show us something profound: desperation. The feeling of being broken and lifeless is not the end of the story. Even when everything seems lost, when we are in the valley of our lives, there is always the possibility of restoration, if we are willing to listen and trust. God showed Ezekiel that no matter how dry the bones are, the breath of life can still reach the deepest places. Desolate, just as he restored that army, he can restore hearts and destinies. Ezekiel's decisions, trust, obey, and prophesy, are a reflection of how, in our lives, we are often called to act in faith, even without seeing the immediate result. The prophet saw the impossible happen before his eyes, not because he could do it, but because he was God's instrument. If you liked Ezekiel's story and want to continue following other stories of faith and overcoming, be sure to like this video and share it with those you love. And of course, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new content. Together, let's explore more powerful lessons from the Bible.